Imagine a book that promises to reveal what really happens after death, guiding consciousness through the mysteries between one life and another. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is this work. We explore his bold teachings, which transform the fear of death into a journey of discovery and liberation. In this video, you won't just hear about the afterlife. You will understand how this ancestral knowledge can redefine your relationship with existence and the unknown. Prepare to open your mind and connect with a spiritual legacy so profound that it still echoes through Tibetan temples and the hearts of seekers around the world. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo Thödol, is a unique and provocative work that goes beyond any Western concept of death. In this video, you will learn why this piece of spiritual literature still intrigues and fascinates scholars and seekers of profound answers. The book is not just a collection of ancient prayers. It is a true map of consciousness in its most critical moment, the afterlife. Written to be read aloud to the dying or deceased, it guides the soul through different stages called bards, where she comes across visions, intense lights, and deities that symbolize aspects of the unconscious. What makes this book so impressive is his frank and lucid approach to the transition between life and death. He does not romanticize the process or hide it in indecipherable mysteries. Rather, it describes in detail how to recognize and deal with experiences that arise in this state. More than a passing manual, it is a treatise on the essence of the human mind, offering a way of seeing death not as a feared end, but as a chance for self-liberation. In this video, we will explore the timeless wisdom contained in these teachings and understand why the Bardo Thödol remains a revered guide for centuries, challenging and expanding our understanding of life, death, and what may lie beyond. The Bardo Thödol is a monumental work that transcends the simple definition of a sacred book. It is a profound spiritual guide designed to be read during and after a person's death, serving as a map for consciousness on its journey through the bardos, the intermediate states between death and rebirth. The term of bardo refers to these intervals, periods of transition that offer both challenges and opportunities for liberation. The Bardo Thödol is, in fact, a detailed manual on how to deal with the post-death process in a conscious and awakened way, allowing the soul to escape the cycle of rebirth, samsara, and reach the state of enlightenment. Many think that the Bardo Thödol is just a religious or mystical text, but that is reducing it too much. It is a courageous and fascinating exploration of the human mind at its purest and most unguarded state, when all the illusions of physical life fall away. Divided into different sections that deal with bards progressively, the text explains how the soul first encounters the clear light of conscience, a moment of potential union with the Absolute. Then comes the Bard of Visions, where the mind projects peaceful and angry deities, symbolizing aspects of the unconscious and emotional experience. The realism of Bardo Thödol lies in his detailed description of human reactions to death. Fear, confusion, resistance, and, finally, acceptance. It speaks directly to human nature, preparing the mind to recognize these manifestations as its own creations, thus avoiding panic and loss of control. This practice is not a dogmatic doctrine, but training for the mind to face the unknown in a lucid way. The Bardo Thödol teaches us that death is not the opposite of life, but an extension of it, a process that, if understood and embraced, can lead to liberation. In this video, we will explore how these ancient concepts continue to influence spiritual and philosophical practices, resonating with our modern search for meaning and transcendence. Understanding the Bardo Thödol, it is more than a religious study, is a dive into the essence of what it means to be conscious and impermanent. The Psyche Bardo is one of the most profound and intriguing phases described in the Bardo Thödol, the well-known Tibetan Book of the Dead. This stage is the exact moment of death, where consciousness separates from the physical body and begins its transition. Unlike many Western ideas about death as an abrupt end, the Psyche Bardo teaches us that it is a process, a threshold that reveals the essence of the mind in its purest state. Here, everything we know, our identities, fears, attachments, loses relevance, and what remains is naked consciousness, facing the unknown. During Chikai Bardo, the soul is faced with the clear primary light, a glow of absolute purity that, according to Tibetan teachings, represents the true nature of the mind, without distortions. This is the most powerful moment to achieve total liberation, as consciousness is no longer limited by the illusions and conditioning of life. However, for many, this light is so intense and unfamiliar that it is difficult to recognize and accept it. Fear or confusion can cause the soul to stray, ignoring this unique opportunity for liberation. The interesting thing about Chikai Bardo is how it reflects the human duality between fear and transcendence. He reminds us that, at the most vulnerable moment of existence, the mind projects its insecurities, but it also has the ability to perceive the ultimate truth. It is a phase that can be liberating, but only for those who have managed to train the mind to remain present and aware, even in the face of the fading of the physical body. This is not a simple matter of faith. It is a practice of deep understanding, of familiarization with impermanence. The Bardo Thödol suggests that, for those who recognize and accept the clear light, union with the Absolute is possible, breaking the cycle of samsara. But the realistic beauty of the Chikai Bardo is in admitting that most of us are not ready. The mind, accustomed to its projections and fears, often retreats. And that's where the journey through the other bards begins, with their visions and challenges. Understanding the Chikai Bardo is not just a reflection on death, but on life. How we face our transitions, how we deal with the unknown, and how we prepare for the inevitable physical end. This part of Tibetan teachings is not a distant study. It is a call for us to recognize the power of being present and aware, both in life and in the final moment. Carl Jung, the renowned Swiss psychologist, found in Bardo Thödol a reflection of the depths of the human mind and its universal archetypes. For Jung, the peaceful and wrathful deities described in the Tibetan text were not just religious figures but symbols of the psyche, representing internal forces and unconscious aspects of the mind. He saw in these images the manifestation of archetypes, patterns of behavior and thought that reside in the collective unconscious, a deep layer shared by all humanity. This Jungian perspective sheds new light on the Bardo Thödol, allowing the West to understand bardos not just as mystical states, but as metaphors for the inner experiences we face, especially in moments of transformation and crisis. Wrathful deities, for example, can be seen as confrontations with our fears and repressed impulses, while peaceful ones symbolize the peace and potential for enlightenment we all carry. By applying his theories to understanding the Bardo Thödol, Jung paved the way for a dialogue between psychology and spirituality, suggesting that the study of intermediate states of mind can offer valuable insights into how we deal with change, the unknown, and mortality itself. This approach makes us realize that what we face in life and death are often projections of our mind, and that the true journey is to recognize and integrate these aspects to achieve a more complete and balanced consciousness. The clear light of consciousness, mentioned in the Bardo Thödol, is a concept of almost ineffable depth, challenging common ideas about what the mind is and the essence of human experience. In the context of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, clear light is the manifestation of the true nature of the mind, a pure and unaltered state that reveals itself at the moment of death. When consciousness detaches from the body, it is confronted by this intense light, which is described as radiant, brilliant, and of unparalleled clarity. This is the ultimate point of spiritual potential, a unique chance to achieve total liberation by merging with this essence of pure consciousness. But why is clear light so important? Because it represents what Tibetan Buddhists believe to be the original mind, devoid of all the illusions, fears, and conditioning accumulated during life. This is a state of consciousness that, for most, remains hidden beneath layers of worldly thoughts, emotions, and attachments. At the moment of death, however, these layers are temporarily suspended, offering a glimpse of the mind in its truest form. The irony is that although we can all experience this light, few of us recognize it for what it is. Often, the instinctive reaction is one of fear or confusion, removing awareness of this opportunity to unite with the whole and achieve liberation. What the Bardo Thödol suggests, realistically, is that the recognition of clear light is not a trivial feat. It requires preparation, meditation, and inner work that must begin in life. This is why practices like meditation and deep contemplation of impermanence are so valued in Tibetan Buddhism. They train the mind to recognize the nature of reality when the crucial moment arrives. It is an exercise in becoming familiar with one's own essence so that, when faced with the clear light, the mind does not withdraw, but rather accepts it as its true form. At this point, the clear light of consciousness is not an abstract idea, but a call to spiritual action, to be prepared to recognize who we really are when all illusions are shattered. To recognize it is to realize that the separation between the self and the universe never truly existed. It is a glimpse into the state of enlightenment that, for many, is the ultimate goal of all spiritual practices. Therefore, understanding and training to face the clear light are essential, as it is what can free us from the endless cycle of births and deaths, showing that, in our purest essence, we are and have always been conscious luminosity. The Tibetan Bardo, also called the Bardo of Visions, is an impressive phase of the process described in the Bardo Thödol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. If the Tibetan Bardo confronts us with the clear light of consciousness, the Tibetan Bardo plunges us into a world of powerful, symbolic visions that arise from the mind. In this intermediate state, the soul is faced with peaceful and wrathful deities, representations that are not external figures or separate entities, but projections of the deceased's own aspects of the mind. This is the time when the beliefs, emotions, and experiences accumulated throughout life take shape and manifest themselves in a vivid way. The Tibetan Bardo is fascinating because it reveals how the human mind, even in the post-death transition, is still stuck in patterns of attachment, fear, and desire. Peaceful deities emerge first, radiating serenity and compassion. They represent the opportunity to recognize the peaceful and enlightened nature of the mind. However, as the journey progresses and angry deities appear, the setting changes to something more challenging, reflecting the dark parts of the psyche, such as unresolved fears and internal aggressions. This contrast is not a test imposed by something external, but a mirror that reflects the complexity of who we are. This is where the authenticity of the Tibetan Bardo shines. He tells us, bluntly, that liberation or confusion depends on how the mind responds to these visions. If the soul realizes that all these images, however grand or frightening they may be, are its creations, it can transcend this stage and advance to a higher state of consciousness. On the other hand, if fear and ignorance prevail, the mind becomes lost, being drawn into denser cycles of attachment and rebirth. The brutal realism of the Tibetan Bardo is a clear lesson. Even after death, the mind continues to project its illusions. For many, this step may seem like a nightmare. For others, a revelation. The key is how you prepared yourself during your life to recognize the illusory nature of these manifestations. Meditation, the practice of mindfulness, and a deep understanding of how the mind works are essential tools to face this phase in a lucid way. Finally, the Tibetan Bardo is more than a mystical account. He reminds us that the true battle for self-knowledge and liberation begins not in death, but in life. It is an invitation for each of us to look within and recognize the deities and demons that dwell in our minds. Only then, when faced with the visions of the Tibetan Bardo, will we be able to face them with the clarity necessary to move towards true freedom. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, or Bardo Thödol, is much more than a work read out of intellectual curiosity. It is a practical and deeply spiritual guide used in death rituals in Tibetan Buddhism. Its main function is to help the soul of the deceased navigate the post-death stages, known as bardos, that separate life from rebirth. These rituals are not just religious ceremonies, but meticulously organized practices that involve monks, family members, and sometimes the community itself, to ensure that the deceased's consciousness receives guidance and support as it passes through these in-between states. The use of the Bardo Thödol begins on the deathbed or shortly after death. An experienced lama or practitioner recites passages from the book aloud, directing the deceased's consciousness to recognize the lights and visions he will encounter during his journey. This reading is done in a solemn and compassionate manner, with the aim of reminding the soul that it is encountering its own mental projections, a truth that, if understood, can lead to liberation from the cycle of rebirth. The practice is meticulously detailed, with each section of the book corresponding to different moments and aspects of the bards, from the pure, bright light that appears immediately after death to the peaceful, wrathful figures that emerge in the later stages. Tradition emphasizes that recognizing the nature of visions is the crucial point in avoiding confusion and fear. If consciousness is able to realize that deities and images, however intense they may be, are manifestations of the mind itself, there is a real chance of achieving enlightenment. Therefore, the recitation of the Bardo Thödol is not just a ritualistic act, but an active intervention in the destiny of the soul, a support for it to remain lucid and prepared. The book's importance in death rituals reflects a deep understanding of what it means to die consciously. It is a reminder that death is not an abrupt rupture, but a transition that can be lived with lucidity and purpose. In some cases, the reading lasts for weeks, depending on beliefs and circumstances, with the intention of continuing to guide the soul even after the initial stage of death. This practice, which may seem strange or even mystical to Western eyes, is actually a testament to how Tibetan culture views death. Not as a fearful end, but as a passage filled with the potential for self-knowledge and transcendence. Understanding how the Bardo Thödol is used in rituals is realizing that, for Tibetans, death is a moment of deep introspection, where every detail is a chance to recognize the true nature of the mind and achieve ultimate freedom. Each passage, each description of lights, peaceful and wrathful deities, carries a hidden meaning that goes beyond literal interpretation. These elements symbolize aspects of the mind and the process of self-knowledge. For example, peaceful deities represent the enlightened nature of consciousness, an invitation to serenity and acceptance, while wrathful deities reflect our fears, impulses, and repressed emotions, challenging us to see them as our own creations. The intense light mentioned in the text symbolizes the ultimate truth, the essence of pure consciousness. At the moment of death, this light appears as an opportunity for transcendence. However, it is so powerful that, for many, it causes fear and rejection, leading the mind to seek refuge in familiar and illusory experiences. The symbolism here is clear. Liberation is only possible when we recognize the true nature of the mind and overcome the attraction to the known and comfortable. The Bardo Thödol also uses complex imagery to illustrate the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, suggesting that understanding the symbols is a key to transcending samsara. Every detail is a reminder that reality is constructed by our perception, and wisdom consists of seeing beyond appearances and recognizing what is eternal amidst the transitory. Near-death experiences, NDEs, have fascinated both science and spirituality, and their analysis reveals striking similarities with the states described in the Bardo Thödol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. When we analyze the reports of people who have experienced NDEs, many describe encounters with an intense and comforting light, a feeling of expanded consciousness and the temporary loss of awareness of the physical body. These details echo what the Bardo Thödol calls the clear light of consciousness, which appears in the Chikai Bardo, the first stage after death. This light is not just an external manifestation. In the Tibetan text, it is the essence of the mind in its purest state, an opportunity for transcendence that few recognize. Visions of spiritual figures or beings of light reported in NDEs also recall the peaceful and wrathful deities of the Konyad Bardo. In Tibetan work, these figures are not seen as external entities, but as projections of the unconscious, reflecting the deepest aspects of who we are. Similarly, many people who experience NDEs report encounters that seem to symbolize judgments or life reviews, but which, on deeper analysis, can be understood as confrontations with their own consciousness and with the internal elements they carry throughout life. Another intriguing similarity is the altered perception of time and space. In NDEs, time often appears to be non-existent, and the person reports a feeling of oneness with the universe, a dissolution of the self. This is very similar to what is described in the Bardo Thödol as transcending the ego and connecting with wholeness. The message of both NDEs and the Tibetan Book of the Dead is clear. Consciousness continues, but the way it is perceived and experienced depends deeply on the person's mental state and degree of self-knowledge. The realism of the Tibetan text in describing these phases is not only spiritual but also psychological. He suggests that the mind, at its essence, is both the battlefield and the path to liberation. And this is confirmed when we hear stories of people who, after an NDE, return with a renewed understanding of life and death, a greater clarity about what really matters. It is as if they have crossed, albeit briefly, one of the bardos, experienced its possibilities and returned with the wisdom that death is a transition, not an end. The similarities between near-death experiences and bardos reinforce the idea that preparing for the moment of death is not an empty mystical ritual, but a practice that teaches us to deal with the unknown, to face our own demons, and to recognize the light that was always there, waiting to be seen. The appearances of peaceful and wrathful deities represent one of the most enigmatic and revealing moments of the afterlife journey. These figures are not merely external entities, but rather projected reflections of the mind of the deceased, manifestations of the internal aspects we carry in life. Facing them is, in fact, facing the entirety of our being, the parts we accept and those we avoid. The peaceful deities are seen first, appearing in an atmosphere of serenity and compassion. They symbolize our ability to understand the true nature of the mind, the innate potential for enlightenment and inner harmony. However, soon after, the angry deities appear, with their fierce and imposing appearance. This moment is not a punishment, but a reflection of the repressed emotions and dark impulses that inhabit the psyche. They represent fear, anger, and all the forces that the mind normally hides deep within. The encounter with these figures is a test of recognition. Understanding that they, like the peaceful ones, are creations of the mind, is essential to not get carried away by confusion and terror. The most impressive thing about this teaching is the realism with which it addresses human complexity. No mind is made only of light or shadow. We are a spectrum, and the Bardo Thödol teaches that recognizing this duality is the path to freedom. When the soul understands that all visions, peaceful and angry, are projections of itself, it has the chance to overcome fear and avoid attraction to cycles of rebirth. This is the key. Not to run away from the angry deities, but to recognize them as part of the experience, as aspects that can be integrated and overcome. Spiritual practice throughout life is crucial to prepare for this encounter. Meditation, self-analysis, and contemplation of impermanence help the mind become familiar with its own projections, reducing the shock and rejection that could arise. Seeing deities as internal aspects is not a poetic idea, but a realistic perception that challenges the mind to look at itself with brutal honesty. Ultimately, the encounter with these deities is a confrontation with one's essence, and the profound understanding that true peace does not come from escaping the unknown, but from accepting our entire nature. The Sitpa Bardo, known as the Bard of Renaissance, is the last phase in the transition cycle described in Bardo Thödol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This stage is perhaps the most loaded with symbolism and deep meanings, as it is here that the soul, after having gone through peaceful and angry visions in the true Bardo, faces the inevitable search for a new body and a new life. The Sitpa Bardo, it reflects the continuity of the cycle of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and the power of karma in determining the next existence. At this stage, the soul's mind is dominated by a series of images and experiences that lead it towards rebirth. The descriptions of the Bardo Thödol about this phase are not mere allegories. They capture the struggle of consciousness which, still trapped by its illusions and attachments, finds itself drawn back to the material world. Here, the desires, fears, and mental patterns accumulated during life play a fundamental role, influencing the way the soul chooses, or is impelled to choose, its next rebirth. It is an instinctive and unconscious process, often driven by forces that the mind cannot master without prior preparation and self-knowledge. The most fascinating thing about Bardo is how he highlights the power of the mind to shape its own reality. Consciousness, still in a state of transition, seeks familiarity and the satisfaction of desires that it was unable to achieve in life, resulting in an almost magnetic attraction to new forms of existence. Visions in this bardo include scenes of possible parents and acts of conception, symbols of choosing the next cycle of life. It is a vivid illustration of how karmic tendencies influence the conditions and circumstances of the new existence. Understanding the bardo is to realize that rebirth is not a random process, but the direct reflection of the state of mind and accumulated actions. To avoid being blindly swept along by the flow of samsara, the soul would need to have recognized and overcome illusions during the previous bardo phases. Mental training, the practice of detachment, and a deep understanding of the transitory nature of existence are, therefore, essential for those who wish to transcend this stage and reach a higher state of consciousness. The bardo teaches us that rebirth is not just a new chance, but a return conditioned by the same forces that governed the previous life. It is a cycle that can only be broken by the mind that can see beyond desire and illusion. It is a blunt reminder that liberation from samsara begins long before death. It is forged in the way we live, the consciousness we cultivate, and the choices we make on our spiritual path. The influence of karma on rebirth is one of the most fascinating and, at the same time, challenging concepts to fully understand. In the context of the Bardo Thödol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this idea is explored clearly and directly, revealing how actions and intentions accumulated during life shape the soul's journey and define its next destination in the cycle of samsara. The continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Karma, often misinterpreted as a kind of cosmic punishment or reward, is actually a law of cause and effect deeply rooted in the dynamics of the human mind and behavior. It reflects the choices, thoughts, and attitudes we cultivate. Each action generates a seed that, sooner or later, bears fruit and influences our future experiences. At the moment of death, these karmic seeds begin to germinate intensely, determining how consciousness moves through the bardos and where it will be taken in rebirth. The bardo, the bardo of rebirth, illustrates how karmic tendencies, that is, the impulses generated by our past actions, direct the soul in search of a new body. It is as if the inclinations of the mind, formed by habits, fears, and desires, act as magnetic forces, attracting consciousness to contexts and situations that resonate with these same energies. The choice of the next rebirth is therefore not random. It is a direct reflection of what was cultivated in life. If the mind has been dominated by anger, attachment, or ignorance, the next cycle of existence tends to be influenced by these qualities, generating challenges and limitations that mirror these tendencies. However, the karma perspective also offers hope and agency. Understanding that our actions have a direct impact on our future journey suggests that, with conscious effort and spiritual practice, it is possible to cultivate more positive karma and thus more favorably influence future lives. Meditation, the practice of compassion and the search for understanding the transitory nature of all things are ways of purifying karma and preparing the mind for a more conscious transition that is less marked by attachment. Ultimately, karma is a manifestation of the mind's power to create reality in life and beyond. Rebirth, guided by karmic impressions, is both a continuation and an opportunity. It is a reminder that liberation from samsara begins with the way we live today, with the consciousness we cultivate and the choices we make in each moment. Understanding and working with karma is therefore a path to not only accepting rebirth but, ideally, transcending it. Modern interpretations of the Bardo Thödol, or Tibetan Book of the Dead, show how this ancient text managed to transcend its Tibetan origin and influence the way the West views death and spirituality. In recent decades, scholars, psychologists, and spiritual practitioners have viewed this work not just as a religious manual, but as a profound exploration of the human mind and the experience of the transition between life and death. Carl Jung, for example, recognized the book's symbolism as a rich representation of the collective unconscious, where peaceful and wrathful deities reflect universal archetypes that still resonate in the modern psyche. The impact of the Tibetan Book of the Dead on the West is also evident in how we have begun to approach death more consciously and less fearfully. Hospitals and palliative care centers have been inspired by his teachings to help patients face death with more acceptance and serenity. The idea that death is a transition, not an end, and that consciousness continues in some form, has brought comfort and changed the narrative about grief and loss. With the growing popularity of meditation and mindfulness practices, the concepts of self-observation and recognition of the mind's illusions, central to the Bardo Thödol, have become part of the Western spiritual and psychological vocabulary. This text, with its precise descriptions of the intermediate states of mind, continues to challenge, inspire, and influence the way we think about life, death, and what may lie beyond it. The transition of consciousness between bardos, as described in the Bardo Thödol, is a complex and profound process that exposes the nature of the mind in its rawest and purest forms. Each bardo, from the moment of death to rebirth, represents an intermediate stage where consciousness navigates between lucidity, confusion, and self-revelation. The first bardo, the psyche bardo, brings the clear light of consciousness, a unique opportunity to merge with the essential nature of the mind. If the soul recognizes this light, it can achieve liberation. Otherwise, it moves on to the following stages. In the Coniad bardo, or bardo of visions, the mind encounters its internal projections, which manifest as peaceful and wrathful deities. These are reflections of the fears and virtues of consciousness, and the recognition of this duality is fundamental to not get lost in illusions. The interesting thing here is that the mind is continually confronted with its own creations, a direct mirror of its state in life. If a person has prepared themselves through meditation and contemplation, they can recognize these manifestations as projections and avoid being swept away by fear. Finally, the Siddha bardo is the bardo of rebirth, where consciousness, influenced by karma, is attracted to a new body. This stage reflects the strength of tendencies and desires accumulated throughout existence. Transiting through the bardos is not a passive process. It is a journey where perception and recognition of the mind determine the path. With practice and self-knowledge, the transition between these states can be faced with lucidity, avoiding the unconscious repetition of cycles of rebirth and opening doors to liberation. Tibetan teachings go beyond a distant spiritual doctrine. They are practices that are deeply applicable to everyday life, shaped to transform the way we interact with the world and with ourselves. At the heart of these teachings is the idea that the mind, when trained, is the key to inner peace and clarity. Meditation is not just a refuge, but a tool for observing thoughts and emotions without identifying with them. This simple act of presence allows us, even in the midst of a chaotic routine, to react with more balance and less attachment. Another important pillar is the understanding of impermanence. By remembering that everything is temporary, from small joys to difficulties, we learn to cultivate a more resilient and less anxious perspective. This teaching encourages valuing the present moment without clinging to the fear of what is to come or the weight of the past. Compassion is also central. In Tibetan Buddhism, practicing it goes beyond sympathy. It is a conscious commitment to connect and act for the benefit of others. Incorporating this into daily life changes how we relate to each other and how we understand interdependence. These teachings are a call to practical action, to live with more awareness, less reactivity, and a deep respect for the impermanent nature of everything around us. The Bardo Thödol, or Tibetan Book of the Dead, contains powerful lessons to transform our perception of death and, consequently, life. One of the most impactful messages of this sacred text is that the fear of death is, in large part, an extension of ignorance about the true nature of the mind and existence. Tibetan teaching proposes that fear is not just a reaction to the end of life, but a reflection of how we relate to impermanence in general. Learning to overcome this fear begins with understanding that death is not an abrupt end, but a transition, a continuity of consciousness that passes through intermediate states, known as bardos. The Bardo Thödol takes us into deep insight into how the mind reacts when faced with the unknown. At the moment of death, according to the text, consciousness separates from the body and enters a state of pure experience, where it can encounter the clear light of consciousness, a manifestation of its true nature. If the mind is trained to recognize this light, liberation from the cycle of births and deaths is possible. However, if fear and confusion dominate, the soul follows a path of illusions and attachments, re-entering samsara. The practice of meditation and contemplation on impermanence are central teachings that prepare the mind to face this transition with more calm and less fear. When we cultivate an awareness of death in life, not as something morbid, but as a natural and inevitable part of existence, fear loses some of its power. The Bardo Thödol reminds us that acceptance of impermanence is the antidote to existential anxiety. This does not mean being indifferent to death, but rather facing it with an understanding that goes beyond the survival instinct. Preparing for death is actually a practice to live better. When we learn to deal with what is beyond our control, we develop a more compassionate and conscious perspective. The lessons of the Bardo Thödol suggest that a mind trained to see death with clarity and acceptance can also face life's adversities with more resilience. By recognizing the temporary nature of all things, we not only overcome the fear of death, but we learn to live with an intensity and peace that is truly liberating. Preparation for death in the context of Tibetan teachings goes beyond passive acceptance. It is an active practice of training the mind to recognize and deal with the inevitable. Advanced meditation practices play a central role in this process, cultivating the lucidity and presence of mind necessary to face the transition between life and death with clarity. Meditations such as Phawa, which involves visualizing the transfer of consciousness into a state of pure light, help the mind become familiar with the experience of death and develop a more intimate understanding of what it means to leave the physical body. These practices are not about escaping fear, but facing it with a mind trained not to get caught up in attachment and confusion. Deep meditation teaches you to observe thoughts and emotions without identifying with them, an essential training for the moment of death, when the mind is prone to getting lost in projections and illusions. Practicing meditations that contemplate impermanence also strengthens mental resilience, allowing the person to perceive death not as an abrupt event, but as a passage that can be handled with awareness. Thus, when preparing for death, one also prepares to live in a more present and awakened way, transforming fear into a deeper understanding of one's own existence. In conclusion, understanding and applying advanced meditation practices and teachings like those of the Bardo Thödol invites us to rethink our relationship with life and death. It's not just about facing the end with courage, but about living with more depth and authenticity, knowing that every moment counts. If this made you reflect or sparked curiosity, leave your comment below. We want to know your impressions and whether you would like more content on topics as transformative as this. We are just beginning this journey of exploration and knowledge, so subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next studies and share with those who need to hear these messages. Until the next video.